Dr. Ragsdale, can you speak a little bit about power? So, for those who are just starting out on the journey of understanding power in systems, and particularly in church systems, since that's where many of us spend our days, many of our audience members, what do you think might be a healthy first step for folks who are just becoming aware of this language?
Well, I think the first step in this process is awareness that we are all born into these systems, hospitals, schools. I mean, the very nature of becoming human is connecting up to how these systems impact us. So having that awareness, and so we all then are equated with what power feels like for us individually. And since we have the knowledge, self-knowledge, or collective historical knowledge of ourselves with these systems, we understand that most processes of change requires understanding the nature of systems. So systems, for example, can be hierarchical. For example, the shape of a triangle, where at the top of the triangle, there's power, and then it's sort of, there's different layers underneath. That's one way to think about a system. And some systems are arranged as rectangles. So there's not this, there's power over here, and so forth. So I'm trying to give our viewers and listeners this idea that there are systems and there are shapes to those systems.
Yeah.
Now, understanding the system, the shape of that system, the role and function of the people in that system, then you become aware of how power then moves through that system. So in the United States, for example, most of our systems are headed up by white men. And so at the top, if it's hierarchical, you have white men. And then, of course, above them, you have the boards. So you can see in the construction of most corporations or most organizations, there's a white woman or white man, or there are occasions where there are people of color at the top, but generally speaking, it's a white person. And so understanding the relationship between that person at the top and your role um, helps you become sensitive about what can happen or not happen or whatever, so forth.
Yeah.
So when I talk about awareness and understanding the relationships between people in the system, I've worked for a number of years before I became a psychologist. I was a temp, a temp for like 2 years, and I've been involved in lots of different organizations, right? So although I'm talking about there's somebody at the top, there are times when the person who has the most power in the system is the person who sits at the front desk.
Yeah.
And they know everything. They know who's coming, who's going. And so I learned early on in my graphic design career that getting to know that first person of contact, if they understood what I was trying to achieve in that system, they would say, hey, I know you're trying to get in the door to see this art director, but guess what? They go to lunch at Tuesday at blah, blah, blah. So
Mm.
if I were you, I would da, 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 da. I was like, okay, cool.
Yeah.
So you can see now that I'm building a relation with a person in that system.
Yeah.
So that's a form of power, negotiation of power. It's building community and so forth.
Mhm.
So understanding the awareness of people in the systems, and then if we need to dismantle or reduce the negative dysfunctional elements in the system, we then begin to understand the role connection between people and the functioning of a system. As I was trying to underscore, we know that there are dysfunctional negative aspects of systems, and that when people join together around correcting that system, that's when we see structural change.
Yeah.
And let me try to give you one small example, another example of how systems change. So in most corporations, for example, there was a call for employees to return back to the office full time. It was like, okay, COVID's over, everybody back to the office full time. But what is emerging actually is a consensus model where many employees feel like they still need that flexibility. And so some corporations now have things like, well, you've got to come in at least 3 weeks, or you got to come in whatever. So the heads of these corporations, they realized that they could not easily demand that everyone come back
Mm.
into that system. And so then the systems changed, and they changed because the employees were essentially saying, hey, I can be equally productive and so forth. Now, how this ends, I don't know, but I'm using this as an example where you can see that people together then change the nature of that
Yeah.
system.
Yeah.
And that's the same power that youth ministers, churches, organizations, they have this ability
Mhm.
to actually coalesce around what they want to see changed. And building change requires
Yeah.
this consensus building in groups of people agreeing. And in fact, this is how, for example, we've gotten our public education system, because African Americans, for example, had this one school concept, and that concept was you all go to the school. And now we can see that there's been an outgrowth of public education over many, many years. But because the community of Black folks actually got together and they made this sort of the cooperative agreement to
Yeah.
educate their children, who they saw as not just being enslaved. They saw that there's value in knowledge and their teaching and so forth. So each generation of African Americans, for example, in this country, have always valued deep forms of knowledge, gaining knowledge,
Right. Yeah.
not just solely on physical abilities,
Right.
but the sort of ways that we as African Americans have embrace our learning,
Mm.
and and it is deeply tied to systemic change, which then all of us, I think, benefit from. Um, but it grew out of this thing that I'm trying to describe, this collective conversation and wills.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, in all of the examples, I think that you just named, um, what I something I'm gleaning is that this isn't necessarily power that is gifted to an individual. It's the building up of a community and it's almost it's topsy-turvy, right? It's the Hamilton turn the world upside down stuff where we're talking about office administrators or secretaries having as much power, if not more so, than a CEO, right? Because gosh, I know of many folks in positions of quote unquote power who would be helpless without their office
Yeah,
administrators, right? Or the African American community saying, no, we are going to come together and name this need and do something about it, actually, no matter what power we have been uh, given by the community or not, actually, right? So, or given by the outside culture or not. So, yeah, what a gift. That's really powerful. It for youth ministers who are on the low end of the totem pole in church world most of the time, some aren't even employed, right? They're volunteers, to be able to say, no, actually, I can claim some power here and I can work to shift the system if I see an injustice or if I see a need that I know I can address, even though I'm not in the highest office here or in the first chair. I can make some impact. So yeah, that's helpful.
and I think this is how society has changed over time. The people who are perceived to have the less power
Yeah.
often become very powerful because they share knowledge, they share information, they share
Yep.
things. So, and I don't think power per se is a necessarily a negative thing. I see power um, as a collective community expression of having needs met.
Yeah.